Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this session. I am so excited to be here today to chat with you about some recent work we've been doing in unpacking and understanding online hate and harassment. This work is done in collaboration with some awesome folks from Google, UIUC, Stanford, Cornell Tech, NYU, UCL, and BU. Now, before we begin, I want to just briefly mention that this presentation will be talking about potentially difficult experiences. So if you want to pause or skip over this video, now is a good opportunity to do so. Okay, let's get started. So if you spend even a little bit of time on the internet, you've probably heard about increasingly toxic online environments. Now, without additional context, you might think hate and harassment experiences mostly consist of bullying or trolling, but actually there is an increasingly diverse set of complicated ways that folks are being targeted by hate and harassment online. So for example, in 2016, Leslie Jones, famous for her roles on SNL, was the target of a coordinated campaign of toxic comments and hate, wherein thousands of internet accounts sent her threatening messages with the eventual result of her leaving social media platforms entirely. And in another example, the Twitch streamer Nate Hill was swatted while streaming, which is when an attacker maliciously calls law enforcement to a target's address under false pretenses of abuse or misconduct. And these are not just attacks that impact high-profile people. Studies from the Pew Research Center and Microsoft tell us that these attacks are widespread, with an estimated 41% of people in the US and 40% of people globally reporting experiencing online hate and harassment in some ways. And these kinds of online experiences often have devastating effects on internet users' mental, emotional, and physical health. Now, I've described just a handful of the kinds of attacks that fall within scope here. So what is it that ties all of these internet experiences together? Well, it's the intent of the attacker. And the intent of the attacker here is to inflict emotional harm, to instill a sense of fear, or to control the target of the abuse in some way. And this is a marked difference than the traditional forms of abuse the security community has historically dealt with. Incentives for what I'll call classic abuse, like spam, phishing, and DDoS, is often profit motivated. But online abuse, how internet adversaries use technology to harm people, is changing. And over the course of this talk, I'm going to make the argument that we, the security community, can and should step up to address online hate and harassment as a core security problem. Now, I'll add one thing here, which is that the attacks that we'll be talking about are enabled in some part by technology. And as such, we'll be discussing how technology can play a role in the solution. So to start reasoning about this, we went to the computing literature. We examined the last 5 years of research on online hate and harassment from Oakland, Usenet Security, CCS, CHI, CSCW, and ICWSM, which are prominent HCI conferences, the Web Conference, SOUPS, and IMC. We used this foundation as a set of seed papers to find other related work from other disciplines in social sciences, and then expanded that set to also include major news events from the last several years to help contextualize the research work. In total, we reviewed over 150 research papers and news articles in online hate and harassment. And through that process, we started to build out a threat model, defining the targets of the abuse and the attackers that perpetrate it. The targets in abusive attacks can be an individual, but can also be groups of people. And oftentimes these are groups historically at risk of broad harassment, like religious minorities or members of the LGBTQ community. And again, an attacker's main goal here is to emotionally harm or coercively control the target. And given that broad goal, attackers can often take on many different shapes depending on the kind of attack they want to conduct. So for example, on the one end, an attacker could be highly privileged, like a spouse, family, or peers who have regular or consistent access to a target's devices, and in some cases, their internet connection altogether. On the other end, we have seemingly faceless anonymous internet mobs who, although may be easy to ignore independently, might use their collective power to bombard and overwhelm a target with toxic messages. In our threat model, we make no assumption about the capabilities of attackers, any communication channel between the attacker and target, or any protections available to targets. And we do this because online hate and harassment attacks often take on many different forms, and each contains a unique set of properties and criterion that differentiate them from one another. So through our literature review, we identified 3 broad criteria that capture the hate and harassment attacks we observed. So these pertain to the intended audience of the attack, the medium that the attack takes on, and the fundamental capabilities of the attacker. So let me go into detail and provide some examples. So in the audience category, Our two criterion are whether the attack is intended to be seen by the target or intended to be seen by an audience or by the public. So for example, online bullying or trolling is used specifically to inflict direct emotional harm to the target. And so is an example of being explicitly intended to be seen by that target. Doxing, on the other hand, which is when an attacker searches for and then publishes private or identifying information about a target to the public internet, gains its power from disseminating data widely, and so is an example of needing to be seen by an audience. We note that these categories are not mutually exclusive. So though the main objective of online bullying may be to target an individual, the attacker may also want to encourage others to bully that individual, which can then benefit from their attacks being seen by the public. Also important in distinguishing these kinds of attacks are the medium used to deliver the attacks. So not every attack uses some kind of media, for example, text, images, or videos to harass someone. So for example, swatting, which leverages an external party to inflict harm and often has no direct link between the attacker and the target of the abuse. And finally, attackers often require different capabilities to conduct different kinds of attacks. So an attacker may need to deceive an audience to conduct attacks like an impersonated profile or a deepfake, which takes the likeness of an individual and has them say or do things that never happened. Similarly, an attacker may need to deceive a third-party authority, like a platform in the case of false abuse reporting. Other attacks may require amplifications, for example, attacks like raiding or dogpiling, that require hundreds of accounts to target an individual all at once require amplification. And finally, attacks may require some privileged access to information. So for example, surveillance attacks often require direct access to target's devices or internet connection that most remote adversaries would not have access to. Through our systematization, we came up with 7 broad classes of online hate and harassment attacks that capture the 38 attacks that we observed in our literature review. Now, you might have picked up on this in the way that we're describing each attack, but tying this back to security, we also describe how each attack violates a fundamental computer security principle, either confidentiality, integrity, or availability. So for example, with attacks like bullying or trolling, which fall into the toxic content attack type, this targets the availability of the system to users. So if a regular authorized user can't use the system due to constant harassment, you've got an availability problem. And in the case of content leakage, so for example, doxing or leaking non-consensual intimate imagery, you're breaching the confidentiality of the target. Impersonation attacks muddy the integrity of the system, making it harder to believe that what you're seeing on the platform is actually accurate and trustworthy. And going one step further, each of these attacks also has analogs to classic abuse. So in one example, with an attack like overloading, where a target is overwhelmed by unwanted notifications and messages, often from hundreds of different accounts, well, this feels a lot like for-profit DDoS. And we as a security community have studied botnets and DDoS and the way that coordination happens on the internet. Many of those techniques can be great places in starting to understand the overloading problem. Now, we go into much more detail about these attacks, where they fall into the taxonomy and the specific connections to classic abuse in the paper. But if there's one big thing I want you to take away from going through this exercise of systematizing each attack, it's that online hate and harassment attacks are just as diverse as traditional online abuse attacks. And so there's not going to be one single solution, no magic machine learning classifier, no easy fix to address all of these challenges simultaneously. The only way to address it is a concerted effort from industry and the research community to study, understand, and combat these problems. So we talked about attacks. What we next turn to is understanding how prevalent these attacks are. Understanding what people are experiencing today can inform where we as a research community might want to focus our initial attention and our effort. So to do this, we developed a survey instrument that surveyed approximately 1,000 participants from 22 different countries for 3 years and asked them about their hate and harassment experiences. We solicited these participants through an expert panel from a leading market research firm who also handled country-specific translations and identified what information we could safely collect from participants around the world. And we note that for maximal coverage of countries around the world, some countries don't appear in all 3 years of data, and we exclude those when we're comparing year-over-year trends. Our core question for our participants was, have you ever personally experienced X online? Where X contained a varied list of hate and harassment experiences informed by similar prior work in the space. And finally, we collected demographic data, for example, their gender, whether they identified as LGBTQ, their age, and their social media usage. So what attacks are people around the world experiencing? What I'm showing you here is the fraction of participants globally that noted that they'd experienced one of these attacks. And what we found is that the most prevalent attack participants in our surveys experienced were toxic content attacks. 19% of participants were insulted or treated unkindly, followed by 16% who had someone make hateful comments, and 14% said they'd been called offensive names. This is followed by a smaller prevalence, but often more severe abusive experiences. So for example, 6% of participants had their online accounts hacked by somebody that they know. And this is akin to a privileged attacker or an inside attacker. And 4% of participants had someone use spyware to monitor their activities, highlighting the diversity of harassment experiences that exist across the world. Going further than that, it turns out that depending on where you live in the world, your experiences with online hate and harassment vary. So for example, more than 70% of participants from Kenya and Nigeria reported experiencing online hate and harassment, compared to approximately 40% of participants from the United States. And of course, it's not just where you live that define your harassment experiences, it's also shaped by the multitude of your identities. So to measure this, we modeled experiencing any form of hate and harassment as a binomial distribution, and essentially performed a regression with categorical demographic data as inputs. And for the 12 countries we had year-over-year data, we also modeled harassment experiences as a function of the year. And what we found was that the odds that young participants, those ages 18 to 24, and those who identified as LGBTQ experiencing online harassment was 1.9 to 4 times higher than reference groups in each category. And to make matters worse, hate and harassment experiences are increasing year over year. Compared to 2016, the first year in our survey, the odds of experiencing hate and harassment globally in 2017 increased by 1.2 times, and the odds of experiencing hate and harassment in 2018 increased by 1.3 times. And recent research from Pew in 2021 suggests that even if the experiences themselves are not drastically changing in prevalence over time, the intensity of those experiences and the effects that they seem to have on internet users are actually deepening. So what we're seeing then is not only that there's not going to be one technical solution to online hate and harassment, but that designing defenses has to take into account the online diverse experiences that internet users have. So understanding that first, and then baking that into our design recommendations is going to be an important step in building defenses that work for all internet users. So I want to conclude with a discussion of some of the research directions that we think can have immediate impact and that the security and anti-abuse communities already have some experience with. So in the paper, we outlined 5 different research areas that are informed by both the literature and what industry is trying right now to curb hate and harassment on their platforms. So these are nudges, moderation, automated detection, conscious design, and a focus on policies and education. So we go into much more detail about these areas in the paper, but the one thing I'd like to call out is that the security community already has a lot of experience working with these kinds of interventions. We can rely on our experiences with security indicators and security warnings, our expertise in building automated anomaly detection or automated systems for DDoS protection, and even draw on our work in evaluating security advice to help in this new space. Of course, any of these solutions are not without their challenges. So in giving users more control, we also run the risk of burdening them. In building better tools for moderation, we have to balance and grapple with the risk of censorship of thought. And as we move to a more end-to-end encrypted world, we have to question how we balance user privacy with platform accountability. And the last thing I'll say is, despite all of these similarities, modern abuse is different than classic abuse in the harms. The harms are broader and have the potential to impact every aspect of a person's life. Keeping this in mind and maintaining respect for both the targets of the abuse and those that are doing the work will be very important as we move forward. So to wrap up, we talked about how online abuse is changing and that new forms of online abuse, hate and harassment, can be thought of as a security problem that we should work towards tackling it. Second, online hate and harassment is a pernicious problem that is growing over time and especially dangerous to some internet users, highlighting a need to design techniques that can support all internet users and not just a few. And finally, many of the techniques and defenses that are either already in use or being piloted are those that are well studied by the security community. and we can and should draw on our past experiences in tackling online abuse to address these new challenges. With that, I'll conclude, and I'll leave my information up here for those that have questions or want to contact me. Thanks again for listening.